The room felt unusually still that morning, the kind of stillness that made even the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece seem like an interruption. A violin string, left half-tuned, trembled faintly each time a breeze slipped beneath the window frame. Its solitary vibration seemed to hold the whisper of some forgotten tune. Holmes sat sideways by the cold fireplace, his lengthy fingers motionless on the arm of his chair, his stare fixed upon a small rectangular envelope lying untouched beside a cup of tea that had gone entirely cold. The aroma of it, bergamot, mixed with something metallic, clung to the air, like a spirit reluctant to leave. I had witnessed him absorbed in quiet before, but there was something particularly weighted about this specific pause, as though he were listening not to the room itself, but to some sound recalled or expected in the distance beyond Baker Street. Only the dimming light creeping through the curtains gave any indication that time had not stopped alongside him. The telegram rested there with its delicate blue border catching the light, waiting for the inevitable instant when his hand would lift it from the surface. I felt a strange discomfort, not merely inquisitiveness, as though the thing carried with it the quiet gravity of terrible news. I could not explain why. But the stillness of 221B seemed stretched over a strain that was not wholly ordinary. Even the street below, ordinarily alive with the sound of horse hooves and conversation, seemed dampened, softened, as though London herself hesitated to interrupt whatever revelation had slipped beneath our doorway. If you are willing to accompany us through the winding recesses of that discovery, I shall relate the matter faithfully. For the mystery that emerged from that unopened telegram became one of the most peculiar adventures ever to pass through the chambers of Baker Street. Settle your attention, dear reader, as though joining us beside the cold hearth, for the tale demands as careful an ear as Holmes himself would have required. The instant my fingers closed around the telegram, I felt the faintest tremor of unease, as though the thin slip of paper contained not words, but a breath of cold air from some distant, troubled corner of London. The stillness of 221B Baker Street had been unsettling enough beforehand. Now it seemed charged with a quiet anticipation, as though every object in the room were listening intently. Holmes had not moved since dawn arrived. His profile, carved sharply against the pale light that crept between our curtains, appeared almost statue-like. Only the faint twitch of his left eyebrow betrayed that he had been waiting not for me to speak, but for the telegram itself to bridge the quiet. "Holmes," I began, though my voice sounded strangely subdued to my own ears, "this has just been brought to us." He did not raise his head, but the atmosphere around him shifted. I placed the telegram carefully upon the surface beside his cold tea. The porcelain cup bore a thin ring of dried leaves at its rim, and I found myself irrationally troubled that Holmes had permitted it to cool completely. Ordinarily, during the early hours, he moved between cigarette, ash, and tea with an idle rhythm that was somehow comforting. But he had touched neither since assuming his seat. "It is curious," he murmured at last, his voice lower than usual, "how silence amplifies one's instincts. I am aware of the sender without opening it." I settled into my armchair. "Though uneasily, someone known to you?" "Known to the past rather than the present," he replied. His fingers brushed the envelope, but did not yet claim it. "And that, Watson, makes their message all the more troubling." The street below lent no comfort. A solitary hansom rattled across Baker Street, its wheels echoing with a loneliness that matched the room's peculiar stillness. Somewhere far off, a costermonger called out his dwindling morning wares. But the sound arrived faint and distant. Even London, in all her relentless noise, seemed reluctant to intrude upon whatever secret waited between the folds of that telegram. At last Holmes broke the seal with a movement so swift it appeared involuntary. I watched his eyes scan the contents with the exacting focus of a surgeon. For a brief instant, his expression remained unreadable. Then the slightest tension gathered at the corners of his mouth. "Holmes?" I asked gently. He read the message once more before allowing the paper to fall to his knee. "It is from a man I've not heard from in nearly 9 years. One Simeon Harov." The name struck no memory in me. "A former client?" "A former chemist," Holmes replied. "Once a brilliant one. He conducted studies of such delicacy and ambition that I suspected he had already advanced dangerous steps beyond what respectable science would permit." His gaze drifted toward the window, as if searching the horizon for the very shadow of the man. He was solitary, peculiar, but possessed an admirable mind. Yet that mind, like certain volatile compounds, was prone to sudden and alarming instability. The telegram fluttered between his fingers as he handed it to me. "Come at once. The matter is grave. I am watched. S. Harov. Southwark." The message was brief, yet its brevity carried a desperation that clung to the words like soot. "He believes himself pursued," I said, returning the slip. "Or he wishes me to believe so," Holmes answered. Rising, he moved toward the violin, plucking the suspended string with a single decisive gesture. Its mournful note filled the room before fading into a tremor. He always possessed a taste for the dramatic, but he would not have contacted me without cause. Not after what transpired in '82. I set my pen aside, suddenly alert. What did transpire? Holmes paused with his back to me, hands clasped behind him. "A failed experiment," he said at last, "one that threatened to claim more than the man who initiated it. I urged him to abandon his pursuit. He promised he would. Then he vanished from every scientific circle that once tolerated him." He turned, his face composed, but his eyes bright with a controlled intensity. "I had nearly succeeded in forgetting him, yet here he is, calling from the shadows of Southwark. Then we must go to him at once," I said, standing. Holmes regarded me with a faint, almost grateful look that vanished before it could be named. "Indeed, but we shall go with caution. For if Harov fears he is watched, then his watchers, if they exist, may already know that his message reached Baker Street." He extinguished the lamp by the mantel, though daylight had already claimed the room. As he donned his coat, the earlier stillness seemed to lift, replaced by a taut current of motion. I could feel the familiar sensation of being swept once more into the orbit of a mystery whose nature I did not yet comprehend. We descended the stairs. Mrs. Hudson appeared briefly from the kitchen with a worried line upon her brow. "Mr. Holmes, will you be taking luncheon before you go?" "Not today, Mrs. Hudson," he replied. "This errand may demand the better part of our attention." Outside, the chill clung to the air with an almost metallic sharpness. I hailed a hansom, and Holmes stepped inside with a swiftness that betrayed his urgency. Once seated beside him, I noted the precise way he folded the telegram into his pocket as though preserving it as evidence. "Southwark," he instructed the driver. The horse jolted forward, and Baker Street slid behind us. The city unfolded in its familiar yet ever-shifting panorama. Shopkeepers swept their thresholds with mechanical resignation. A woman tending to flowers in a window box paused to look at our passing cab with faint suspicion. Children darted between the legs of strangers in pursuit of morning mischief, and yet something felt off-kilter, as though London herself sensed the disturbance concealed within that telegram. Holmes leaned back, fingers steepled. "Consider the choice of location, Watson. Harov's shop lies far from the genteel lanes he once frequented. Southwark's labyrinth of alleys provides both cover and danger in equal measure. You believe he hides there?" I asked. "I believe he conducts a manner of work there," Holmes replied. something he preferred to keep beyond the notice of his peers. The hansom turned toward the bridge, where the wind carried the scent of damp stone and river silt. I watched Holmes's reflection in the cab window, sharp, intent, almost austere, and recognized in him the stirrings of an old familiar excitement. Yet beneath it, I detected a second, quieter thread, apprehension. Holmes felt it too, though he masked it well. "What troubles you, Holmes?" I asked. He hesitated, which in itself was answer enough. "There are minds, Watson, that dance too close to their own brilliance. Harrov was one. When such men fall silent, it is seldom because they have ceased their pursuits. Rather, they have ventured beyond the bounds where even the boldest intellects tread safely." The driver slowed as we neared the district. The streets narrowed, pressing close with brick walls stained by age and industry. Signs creaked overhead, their faded letters like whispered warnings. Children's laughter disappeared, replaced by the low murmur of bargaining and the slap of crates upon cobblestone. Holmes leaned forward, peering toward an intersection where an elderly man arranged bottles outside a modest apothecary. "We are near." Our cab drew to a halt before a narrow building whose windows were dulled by dust. Above the door, a sign hung crookedly. Harrov's Chemist and Compounder. Its paint had flaked away, leaving only the ghost of its once proud lettering. Holmes stepped out first, scanning the street with swift precision. "Observe the upper window, Watson," he whispered. There, the glass bore a single jagged crack, radiating like a frozen bolt of lightning. Behind it hung a curtain half drawn, its shadow shifting almost imperceptibly, though whether by draught or presence I could not say. A faint scent reached us, unfamiliar, metallic, tinged with the ghost of something burnt. Holmes drew a slow breath. "Harrov sent for us," he said quietly, "but whether he still waits behind that window is another matter entirely." The street pressed in with suspense, and I felt the first true shiver of foreboding pass through me, as though the air itself inhaled just before revealing something it could no longer conceal. The narrowness of the lane made sound seem intimate and urgent. Each footstep, each murmur, struck the wall and returned as if from a confidant. Holmes moved with the sure and economical gait of a man who has long since learned to reserve his strength for the mind's exertions. Yet his hands betrayed a small restlessness as they searched the door for its brass knob. I observed him closely, because I have always known that in such moments his little gestures are the outward ledger of thought. The shop itself gave a sigh as the door opened, a breath of stale air, the faint tang of medicinal essences, and beneath them that ever-present undertone of some compound not yet named. It was as if the room had been waiting for our intrusion, as one waits for an answer. Inside, the counter sloped downward like a half-forgotten altar, its surface scored by 1,000 appointments of mortar and pestle. Bottles stood in regimented disorder upon the shelves, their labels browned and curling, their contents casting small, listless shadows. Holmes's fingers hovered over a ledger, half buried beneath a tangle of yellowed invoices. He did not lift it, merely skimming the edge with the tip of his forefinger. As if to feel the memory pressed within, I found my eye drawn always upward to the window of the shop's upper room, whose jagged crack now seemed a wound in the face of the building. No light shone from that pane, yet the curtain continued its slight, inexplicable tremor, as though something within, breathed against it, noticed the dust. Holmes said softly, indicating with his chin a shelf where motes lay thick like stars in a stagnant sky. "A careful hand has been here until lately, but not until this morning. See how the footprint upon the counter is smudged. See the smear of coal dust along the sill. Somebody has passed this way in haste or irregular purpose. I leaned forward, and a thin whiff of sulfur reached my nostrils, prickling like a faint reminder of lightning. "There is something else," I murmured, for my eyes had caught upon a small pile of glass fragments at the back of the counter, their edges dull with a powder that shimmered faintly. As if with a secret, Holmes nodded once, the movement as small as a percussion. He drew back a curtain with the gravity of a man about to remove a shroud. Behind it, the stairs climbed in a narrow spiral to the upper room. Their timber was worn by a single tread, and the air that rose from them carried both the chill of neglect and the tang of chemicals used in earnest labor. Holmes's expression had the look of a man whose curiosity and caution stood in equal combat. "We ought to be swift," he said, and the words were not a plea, but a measure of precaution. As we ascended, the light narrowed. A shaft through the skylight painted a pale bar along the wall like an accusation. The upper door bore signs of a recent hand scratches, as if from a nervous knuckle, and about the lock the faint traces of a greasy residue to the touch. I touched it, and my fingers came away with a dust like the ash dregs one finds in a hearth after a long secret fire. Holmes closed the door behind us with a hush that was almost reverent, and I felt the small, intimate thrill of trespass upon a life paused. The room smelled of old paper and a more assertive scent of reagents. There lay broken beakers, like the bones of a failed experiment, and upon the table sat a brass instrument whose purpose I could not name. Its surface was scored with the careful impatience of repeated use. Holmes knelt by the table, and with an economy of motion, arranged the fragments into a small constellation upon the cloth. "Observe, Watson," he said. "The way the powder binds to the glasset is a residue of metallic salts, likely silver and an alkaline, a formula directed at light more than flame. It proves that Harrov experimented with illumination, perhaps luminescent compounds. Yet there is also this." He tilted a piece of torn paper in the weak light. Its edges had been seared, as though by a candle, and upon it a single word remained legible in an angular hand: phosphor. A coldness passed through me, not merely from the draught that pressed at the window, but from the implication of the word. Phosphorus, I remembered, had been the subject of many a curious and dangerous experiment. It glowed with a life both alluring and treacherous. Holmes's jaw tightened for an instant, and then he forced his voice into a mildness that I knew was a mask. "Phosphorus requires care. It demands secrecy. Those who toy with it often speak at night in the language of obsession." From the narrow recess by the window came a soft, rhythmic tapping, faint as a metronome. Holmes rose as though stung. He approached the pane and placed his palm over the crack. The glass vibrated with a subtle echo, as though a small instrument had struck it from the other side. Knock or tremor. He mused aloud. "Someone within used this window for signaling, perhaps. Or else the crack has been caused by some sudden contraction in heat. Yet the rhythm is deliberate." We listened. The sound ceased, left only by a thicker silence against which even the room's smallest sighs seemed noisy. Holmes moved to the recess and peered outward. Below, the street unrolled in its usual commerce, but the faces that passed were quick, a little too mindful of their own business. A boy rushed past with a parcel of bread, his eyes flicking toward our door as though to commit its number to memory. There was a small urgency in every movement, as though those who lived near Herod's shop had begun to measure their days by a new apprehensive clock. Holmes returned to the table, producing from an inner pocket a small lens that caught the light and scattered it into a sudden bloom. He set it over a bruise upon the tabletop where some corrosive substance had been spilled. Under magnification, it revealed a most curious thing: minute crystalline formations shaped not by chance but by intention. Tiny lattice that might serve as the scaffold for a slow chemical reaction. Here is deliberation, Holmes said. These are not the fingerprints of accidental handling. Someone designed the sequence by which this compound should behave. My hand found the torn edges of a matchbook tucked beneath the ledger. Its paper was faintly scorched and bore the shadowy impression of a seal, a crest I could not clearly make out. Holmes took it from me and held it to the light, tracing its outline with a finger. He frowned in a way that spoke of recollection and something like resignation. This crest, he murmured, was associated once with a small society of experimenters who worked at the edge of propriety. They met seldom, and what they shared was often spoken in whispers. Harov belonged to them. The implication hung between us like a low-hanging cloud. I'd heard of such circles, men who prized discovery above prudence, who would risk reputation, fortune, even life for a theory that might change the order of things. Holmes's eyes, when they lifted to mine, were lit with that intense serenity of conviction which both attracts and alarms. If this is so, he said, then there are others who would claim Harov's craft for themselves, or who would see to his silence. A sudden noise from below, voices low and hurried. A cart's wheel grinding against stone drew us both to the window. In the dim street, two men paused beneath the chemist's sign and spoke with a guarded haste. One of them tilted his hat, revealing a jaw that wore the map of many a hard night. The other kept his face shadowed. They exchanged a small package no more, yet it carried the gravity of contraband. For a moment our eyes met, then the pair moved away, heads bent, as if the lane itself demanded discretion. Holmes drew back from the glass. His face had lost some of its earlier animation. A crease of thought had appeared on his brow. Harov's work was not solely for the light of pure learning, he observed, and there was in his voice a delicate bitterness. It carries a commerce in secrecy. We must be certain what commerce, and to whom it might profit. I felt the first true temperature of fear for our missing chemist. Not the melodrama of an imagined villainess, but the real chill that comes with recognition that a man's work has become a currency in which lives might be bartered. Holmes straightened, gathering his tools with an efficiency born of long practice. We shall make inquiries among those who knew him in the laboratories, he said, and we shall question the men who exchanged that parcel. As we descended, the window above us flung a patch of light like a held breath over the counter, and for an instant I imagined the silhouette of a face pressed faintly to the glass. Whether that vision was truth or fancy, I could not say, but it clung to my thoughts as we stepped back into the lane, the city pressing about us with its indifferent industry. The panes crack seemed to watch us as if with an old and private sorrow. We left Harov's shop with more questions than assurance, and the upper window, that small broken aperture into a disturbed life, remained behind us like an unspoken promise. The deeper we moved into Southwark, the more I felt the district exert its dark persuasion, as though it wished to remind any visitor that secrets here were not merely overheard, they were cultivated. The narrow lanes, once lively with morning bustle, had surrendered to a dimmer hush by the time Holmes and I departed Harov's shop. The sky, a dull pewter without promise of rain or sun, seemed to stoop low over the rooftops, trapping every smell, every murmur, every lingering suspicion beneath its weight. Holmes walked half a step ahead with his collar turned upward. From behind, I saw only the steady poise of his shoulders, which to the untrained eye suggested detachment. To me, however, that slight tightening at the base of his neck betrayed a keen alertness. He was listening, not merely to the street, but to its absences. We passed beneath an arch, where a ragman had set up a makeshift stand of faded coats and discarded boots. each tagged with a price, as if the objects possessed a second life yet to be bargained for. When Holmes paused to glance at the array, the ragman's eyes flicked nervously toward the chemist's shop we had just left. Then to Holmes again. It was the sort of glance that pretended ignorance, yet carried recognition in its retreat. Holmes inclined his head politely and moved on without speaking, though I noted the small, satisfied gleam that came to his eye whenever a stranger betrayed more knowledge than he wished to show. The alleys grew narrower as we approached the river, their walls stained by a century of industry and neglect. Here the children who darted between crates in the morning had vanished, replaced by rough-voiced laborers whose glances were quick and appraising. A canal of unpleasant odor ran beneath a sagging footbridge, carrying with it murky secrets from factories upstream. It was a place where one could disappear easily and remain disappeared. Holmes's pace slowed as he studied the ground, the buildings, even the shadows cast by low eaves. As though assembling a map of intentions rather than geography, "I am beginning to see," he murmured. Why Harov believed himself watched. "You fear the men we observed earlier?" I asked. "I fear the sum of subtle movements rather than any single actor," he replied. "Note how the stall-keepers do not call out as we pass. Watson, people here expect to be watched. And that expectation is not born from imagination." A thin woman with a basket of onions nodded to us, but her eyes lingered on Holmes with a curiosity touched by apprehension. Behind her, a narrow door opened suddenly and just as quickly shut, revealing nothing but a sliver of darkened interior where a figure stood too still to be innocent. I felt the hair rise upon the back of my neck. Even London's most disreputable quarters possessed their rhythm, but here the rhythm was broken, stuttering as though some unseen conductor had imposed a new order upon the neighborhood. Holmes guided me into a lane I would not have chosen on my own. Its cobblestones were slick with grime, and the walls pressed inward like conspirators. At the far end stood a small public house, its windows clouded with breath and old tobacco smoke. Above the door, a sign swinging from a chain identified it as the mooring anchor. Holmes held the door for me and lowered his voice. "Keep your senses attentive, Watson. Those who know Harov may be found here, but so too may those who follow him." Inside, the pub was dim, its air thick with aromas of ale, sweat, and the faint metallic tongue of the river not far beyond. A few men hunched over tankards, speaking in low and halting tones. The barkeep, a broad fellow with calloused hands, eyed us without welcome but without surprise. Holmes approached him with the unassuming calm that he wielded more effectively than any uniform could. "A quiet table, if you please," he said. The barkeep jerked his chin toward a shadowed corner, and we sat. A moment later, 2 mugs were placed before us, unasked for, yet unmistakably expected. Holmes paid without comment, then leaned back, studying the room with a perception that could have sliced through brick. His gaze lingered briefly on a man at the far table, small-boned with fingers stained by chemicals. His cuffs burned at the edges. The man noticed Holmes's scrutiny and shifted uneasily, his hand closing around his tankard with a defensive spirit. Holmes rose and crossed to him with the ease of a man making a social call rather than an interrogation. "Pardon the intrusion," he said in that disarmingly mild tone that often coaxed the most stubborn confidences into the open, "but I believe you may have known a chemist by the name of Simeon Harov." The man stiffened. His eyes darted toward the door, as though measuring the distance to escape. "Don't know him," he muttered. Holmes smiled not warmly, but with an understanding so precise it disarmed through its very accuracy. "Then allow me to offer a correction. You knew him in the days when the two of you shared certain supplies, not easily purchased at wholesale. He held up a scrap of burned paper we had collected in Harrod's room. This compound, he continued softly, requires a stabilizer sold by precisely one supplier in this borough, and you, sir, bear the unmistakable mark of it on your cuffs. The man's resolve crumpled like wet parchment. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. I've seen him, he whispered, but not recently. Not since he took to working after dark in that cursed upper room. Light would burn in his window at hours when sensible men slept. Folk in the lane said he was speaking to someone who never answered. Was he alone? Holmes asked. The man hesitated. Alone in body, perhaps, but not in mind. He had company of a sort, the kind a man invents when he has looked too long into the fire of his own thinking. A chill crept into my bones at the phrasing. Holmes nodded slowly, as though confirming an earlier suspicion. And the men who stand below his shop, he asked, what do they want of him? The chemist's gaze hardened. They want what he discovered, or what they believe he discovered. And if they can't have it, they'll have him instead. Before Holmes could speak again, the pub door swung open, admitting a gust of cold river air and a tall figure whose coat was buttoned up to the throat. His entrance stilled the room. Conversations died in mid-syllable. Even the barkeep's habitual movements seemed to stop in that silence. The man's eyes narrowed upon us as though he had come for no other reason than to verify our presence. Holmes turned, giving only the smallest sign of interest. We have attracted attention, he said quietly. Is he one of them? I whispered. One of them? No, one above them, Holmes murmured. Observe the boot's fine leather unsullied by the mud of these streets. His coins pay for silence. He stands not with the watchers, but behind them. The stranger moved toward the bar. Ordered nothing, touched nothing. His eyes flicked to the chemist with whom we had spoken. The poor man shrank visibly in his seat. Holmes inclined his head to me, signaling our departure. As we rose, the stranger's gaze followed us until the door shut behind our backs. Outside, the river fog drifted in low swirls, a natural phenomenon this time, not a narrative device, but it carried with it the faint cries of the docks and the hollow clang of chains. Holmes walked briskly. I imagine, he said, that Harrow's disappearance is now a matter of urgency, not solely for his welfare, but for London's. Do you believe he has created something dangerous? Dangerous? Holmes murmured. No, Watson, not created, reawakened. There are ideas that cannot be wholly buried. However, the world tries to forget them. We crossed a footbridge whose planks groaned beneath each step. The Thames slid beneath, wide and dark, like a thought unvoiced. Holmes paused at its center and looked toward the far bank, where warehouses stood like silent sentinels. Someone, he said quietly, has been using Southwark as the stage for a hidden correspondence. The lights in Harrow's upper window, the tapping upon the pane, the men with parcels all speak of an exchange. And I fear the city is already breathing the consequences. He turned to me with the expression I've seen only when he stands at the threshold of a grave truth. We must find him, Watson, before the shadows that hunt him grow bolder. The river lapped softly at the stone. A shuddering gust rattled the windows of the distant warehouses. And in that moment, I felt London watching us, watching Holmes particularly, with a quiet, heavy anticipation, for now the shadows kept their distance. But I sensed, as Holmes surely did, that they would not remain patient for long. The river greeted us like a living thing, its breath sour with coal and kelp, and the bank itself seemed to keep counsel with the gulls that cried above it. We followed a narrow path of trodden mud. where the footmarks of men and beasts lay layered like the pages of a dirty book. Holmes walked with an economy that suggested patience and constancy rather than haste. To watch him was to watch attention itself manifest in walking form. I felt the chill in my boots seep upward, a damp that took the edge from courage and left only the sober instrument of duty. Here, at the water's edge, the city revealed a different vocabulary. Ropes snapped with the memory of tides. Coils of rope smelling of tar and sweat, and the slow, patient machinery of commerce that knows how to survive neglect. We descended a short flight of stone steps, worn smooth by countless feet, their edges rounded as if the river itself had licked them clean. At the bottom, a single impression in the mud arrested Holmes's attention, a print too narrow for a laborer's heavy boot, yet deeper than that of a child. He knelt, and with fingers deft and unhurried, traced the circumference of it. The mud clung to his nail like a blackened memory. "Here," he said, "we have motion and time recorded faintly. See how the heel shows a slight smear to the right. The man who made this stepped away." Not in haste, but with care, he avoided pressure upon one side. I bent to look, the air thick with the river's breath, and realized that the smallness of the print argued for a lighter frame than I had expected. A messenger? A youth? Holmes did not answer by way of conjecture. His voice was precise. An attendant, perhaps. Not a servant of the docks, but one accustomed to delicate errands. Note also the residue upon the outer edge, cold dust, mixed with something metallic. He had been near the furnaces this morning, and more notably, he had handled a tin which contained a compound that oxidizes like iron filings. That observation tethered the impression to Harrow's shop as surely as any proof. If coal and metal marked the man's passage, then the river and the laboratory had conspired in the same act. Holmes rose, his silhouette slender against the pale sky. "We shall follow the bank eastward," he announced. "The man who left these prints went toward the old rope works. He may have been bound for a meeting, or he may have intended to dispose of what he had carried. We moved between the carcasses of barges and beneath the cant of loading cranes whose chains swung like fat pendulums. Workers paused to regard us with the weary look of men who carry secrets not of their telling. Holmes paused by a barrel whose top had been pried open and examined with that same lens of his, bringing the little instrument close to his eye, as though magnification could summon speech from stillness. He produced from a crevice in the barrel side a scrap of paper rolled into a tight pellet and stained by river water. Unfurling it, he displayed a fragment of a printed receipt, the name of a foundry, a date, and a coded number that might mean weight, might mean price, might mean something more obscure. "It is their ledger," Holmes said quietly, "not the book itself, but a sign they keep in accounting not only of commodities, but of favors." We continued, and our path brought us to a narrow jetty where a thin man in a soiled coat stood with his hands in his pockets and the motionless air of one who has long rehearsed nonchalance. His eyes, nevertheless, betrayed more than his posture did. They followed us with a watchfulness that bordered upon hunger. Holmes addressed him casually, though I could feel the care with which his voice wrapped its inquiry. "You saw a young man pass here not long ago?" he asked. The man reacted first with the habitual caution of his fellows. His breath seemed to hang heavier for a moment, like steam over a pot. Then he nodded. "Came from the chemist's, carried a small case. Didn't look like no smith's boy, looked like someone who'd been apprenticed to nothing but secrets." "Which way did he go?" "To the bridge he went, then left it by the old stables. Sounded like he met another near the gate. Swapped words quick as rabbits. Then off they went one toward the warehouses." the other to the wharf. Holmes's eyes narrowed with a gleam that was almost pleasure. For him, such fractures of testimony were like puzzle pieces freshly turned. Did he say anything you recall? He persisted. The man hesitated, as if fishing for a memory he would rather not have kept. Only that he was told to throw the case into the river if trouble came. Said it would sink quiet as regret. He spat once into the river. The red thread of that motion stained my attention with an unspoken emotion. I could hear clinking once, like someone testing if iron will speak under water. Holmes's mouth moved in a small, private calculation. A case lost to the river is a kind of proof. Evidence denied to the onlooker, yet recorded by the water itself. He stepped toward the edge and held his hand just above the surface. The Thames reflected his face back to him, distorted and serious. If this case contains the compounds we suspect, then the river is at present both repository and accomplice. I felt a tightening about my heart at that thought. The Thames, which supplies London with trade and life, could also be a concealment for reckoning and ruin. Holmes turned from the black mirror. "Watson," he said, "there is yet another matter. Observe the barge moored beyond the pile of timber. Its name is almost effaced, but the lettering bears the mark of a certain shipping house associated with clandestine parcels." We approached, and the barge deck creaked as an old man, no longer able-bodied, but steady of eye caught sight of Holmes, and gave a curt nod. His hands were ringed with discolorations, telltale signs of frequent chemical contact. Holmes showed him the fragment of receipt. The old man's face tightened into a map of memory. "Aye," he admitted. "They offloaded a box last night, came in by moon. Paid extra to have it carried below the bridge." He spat a small, thick word into his hand and held it back to his mouth. "They said it had to be hid betwixt tar and timber till the tide took it. Then the men sent to the docks would take it away when the night was thick." "Who sent it?" I asked. He shrugged in a way that told of his unwillingness to be more than a passive ledger. "Men with plain coats and clean boots. They don't speak like us, don't smell like us neither. Pay in coins that clang new." Holmes's jaw worked the movement of a cog aligning. "We are tracing a corridor of commerce that trades not in cloth or grain, but in compound and consequence. The men with clean boots are the face of that trade." A small, sharp laugh escaped me despite myself, for the city's machinery showed its face at last a commerce with no ledger in the open. Only in the pockets of men who would wear fine boots and honest faces while asking the river to hold their truth. Holmes turned to gaze back toward the path by which we had come. A figure moved along it cloaked and bent, like one who wished to remain the shape of no one's memory. He paused for a moment, and as if to assure himself of solitude, looked straight at us, then away. There was a quarrel of will in that look. He had seen that we had seen him, yet he chose to walk on, as though daring the river to speak about the things it held. "We have witnesses," Holmes said. "We have traces. We have a river that carries both refuge and writ. The question remains, what did Harov entrust to the water? And who possessed the means to command men to bury such a thing beneath tide and timber?" The gulls called overhead like a chorus too casual to be trustworthy. The barge bells chimed faintly, as if to punctuate our ignorance. I felt the weight of the Thames between us, and the answers we sought, a watery veil that would have to be parted by cunning or luck. Holmes watched the moving dark with the steadiness I have seen when he contemplates the mechanics of a case. His face was lit by a resolution that blended determination and foreboding. "We left the river with more than the mud upon our boots," he said quietly. The smell of tar clung to the hem of my coat like a warning. I could not help But think of the man whom we sought. If he had indeed trusted the river with his secret, then the water had taken a vow to hold it close. And men who place trust in the Thames may discover that the river keeps its promises, but not its conscience. As we turned from the steps, a low bell from a distant warehouse tolled, and the day seemed to press upon us like a verdict. The fog that had begun to coil itself along the river embankment did not follow us inland, yet I felt its presence, still an echo of its damp breath, clinging to my thoughts as we walked toward the heart of Southwark. Holmes spoke little, his stride swift but not hurried, the rhythm of his walking shaped by conclusions forming silently beneath the brim of his hat. He carried his cane at a slight angle, tapping once at each corner as though taking the pulse of the street. I have seen him in many states of concentration, but there was something different in him that afternoon, a sharpness tinged with restraint, as though his mind were reaching ahead of itself and he was forcing it to remain tethered to the present. We returned to Harrod's shop shortly after leaving the river, for Holmes claimed that our next answers would not be found in the warehouses or at the docks, but in the room where the chemist had most often held converse with his solitary genius. As we approached, I was startled to notice how the upper window cracked, though it was now seemed almost luminous, as if something faint gleamed behind the half-drawn curtain. Holmes raised his head at the same moment, and his gaze narrowed with a blend of curiosity and unease. "It is merely the angle of the sun," he muttered, though I detected little conviction in his tone. Inside, the room greeted us with the scent of old reagents and the stale breath of seclusion. Holmes lit a lamp despite the daylight, saying only that the quality of illumination was essential to what he intended. The flame flickered, catching in its glow the fractured edges of glass still scattered across the table where Harrov's last experiment had broken. Holmes examined each piece with deliberate care, as though every shard contained a tone in a symphony he alone could hear. "I had forgotten," he murmured, the peculiar devotion with which Harrov approached the manipulation of light. His fingers lifted one of the fragments, tilting it back and forth beneath the lamp. "See how the inner surface is faintly iridescent. This is no residue of common phosphorus compounds alone. He was combining them with something else, an unstable oil of his own refinement. Perhaps." He set the shard down and reached for a small brass container on the counter. Its lid bore the imprint of a crescent scratched into the metal by a hurried hand. Holmes opened it with a care usually reserved for handling venomous creatures. Inside lay a fine powder the color of dry moonlight. "This," he said, "is the stabilizing agent he had devised when he abandoned the dangerous line of inquiry I once urged him to cease." I bent closer. "You advised him to stop before?" "Yes," Holmes replied, his face momentarily shadowed. "Years ago. He pursued a theory about the precise structure of compounds that emit their own light under certain conditions. He believed that with the right proportions, one could create a substance that glowed with steady brilliance without heat. He called it cold fire, though only in jest." Holmes touched a grain of the powder with the end of a thin scalpel. "He nearly blinded himself during one trial. It was then I pressed him gently to turn his mind towards safer avenues." "And he ignored you?" "Worse." Holmes's voice lowered. "He promised compliance, and then pursued his theory in greater secrecy. He moved to this place." Holmes moved to the desk where the torn scraps of paper lay. With the patience of a man reconstructing a shattered confession, Holmes pieced them together until the edges aligned. The scrawled formulas meant little to me, but he read them as fluently as a parson reads his Sunday Psalms. Every now and then he paused, his finger tracing a particular arrangement of symbols, as if reacquainting himself with a ghost from his own past. Then, suddenly, he exhaled sharply, "What is it, Holmes?" "This notation here," he said, pointing. "It references a compound proposed by a German chemist who disappeared before publishing his results. It was whispered, though never proven, that the compound could burn invisibly unless exposed to air rich in oxygen. It was meant to illuminate laboratories without visible flame, but the theory was deemed too unstable." Holmes left the thought unfinished. I did not like its implications in the slightest. Holmes stood, paced once, then returned to the table. His movements grew sharper, more decisive. He opened a small wooden box near the foot of the bed, one we had previously overlooked. Inside it lay several vials sealed with wax, each labeled with a careful but trembling hand. The handwriting swelled and tightened, as though the chemist's nerves had been strained when writing them. Holmes lifted one vial to the light, its contents a translucent fluid that shimmered faintly, moved strangely. As if resisting the bottle's tilt, he refined it further than I imagined possible. Holmes murmured, "Watson, this is not the work of a man who merely feared discovery. This is the work of a man who knew discovery was inevitable, one way or another, before I could question him further." A sudden clatter from below startled us both. Holmes extinguished the lamp in a swift motion and gestured for silence. We stood in the dim half-light, listening, footsteps soft, careful and deliberate, not the tread of a customer, not the bold stride of a laborer. Someone was moving through the shop with the confidence of one who believed himself unwatched. Holmes leaned near the stairwell, and I joined him, heart hammering. The figure moved from the counter to the shelves, examining something with an intent I could feel, but not yet see. A faint creak of glass, a breath expelled quietly. Like a man checking for danger, Holmes said nothing, but I felt his stance shift into that peculiar readiness he possessed whenever stepping over a threshold between knowledge and confrontation. He descended first, silent as a shadow, with me behind him, trying to match his stealth. Halfway down, he paused, raised his hand, and indicated a tall figure by the counter, one we had not encountered before. The man wore a coat of respectable cut, but far too elegant for this district. His boots were polished, though dust from the street clung freshly to the heel. He stood with his back turned, examining a shelf of jars. Holmes stepped forward into view. "That shelf," he said calmly, "contains nothing of value to you, unless you have an interest in obsolete sedatives." The man whirled around so quickly that for a moment the lamplight fractured across his features, making him appear masked. His eyes were sharp, cold, and calculating the eyes of a man accustomed to measuring the worth of others in seconds. "You should not be here," he said, his voice low. Holmes smiled lightly. "And yet here I am. A mutual acquaintance has gone missing. Perhaps you know something of him?" "I know nothing of him." "How curious," Holmes replied, "that you are acquainted enough with his work to search his shop in daylight." A flicker of fear, anger crossed the man's face. His right hand slipped toward his coat pocket. Holmes moved a fraction of a second faster. "Do not," he said in a tone that froze the air. "If you remove that hand with anything concealed in it, you will find my friend here is far less tolerant than I." I stiffened, startled by the implied compliment to my courage, but held firm. The man straightened, abandoning the attempt. "You are interfering with matters that do not concern you," he said. "The chemist made promises he has not kept." "What sort of promises?" The man's lips tightened. "The kind men do not break without consequence." Holmes took a single step closer, not in threat, but in precision. "You speak as though you represent an organization rather than yourself." A silence followed, one heavy as the river mud. The man turned toward the door, his decision made. "You should abandon this pursuit," he said. "If you value your safety." Holmes lifted his chin. "If safety concerned me, sir, I should never have taken up residence in Baker Street." The man offered no reply. He slipped out with such care that the bell above the door barely stirred. Holmes watched the door for several seconds, then turned to me. "We are running out of time. Watson, whatever Harov created, whatever he feared, it has drawn the attention of men who do not hesitate to silence genius." His gaze drifted upward toward the cracked window. "And I believe," he said quietly, "that someone else was here with him, someone who may yet be watching." The room seemed to tighten around us, the air humming faintly with the residue of chemical secrets. Holmes moved toward the stairs again. "There is more to uncover in that upper room," he said, "and the truth will not remain polite while we seek it." The hours that followed were colored by an unease I could neither dispel nor fully articulate. Some cases cast their shadow upon London like a passing cloud quick to blot out the sun, yet quicker still to dissolve. But this, I felt, was no cloud. It was a gathering storm. Holmes sensed it too, though he wore his usual composure as a gentleman might wear his gloves habitually, elegantly, and with only the faintest trace of self-protection. We had returned to Baker Street to reassess our findings and determine our next move, for Holmes insisted that certain connections required the privacy of his own mind and environment to reveal themselves. The fire had burned low, casting a copper warmth across the walls, and I had taken refuge in my armchair while Holmes bent over a makeshift arrangement of vials, powders, and fragments recovered from Harov's laboratory. The air held a tang of something sharp and metallic from his experiments, and though he opened the window a crack to dispel the odor, the cold that crept in with it had a character that seemed to whisper of consequence. Holmes worked in absolute silence, interrupted only by the occasional clink of glass or the faint sound of him inhaling deeply through his nose as he tested the scent of a residue. He had placed the strange shimmering fluid from Harov's vial into a safe receptacle, where it pulsed with the faintest iridescent glow. Lamps were extinguished in favor of a single lantern, whose light he adjusted with scrupulous attention so as not to agitate the compound. "It reacts not only to air," he murmured at last, "but to illumination, a most unusual dual sensitivity." I leaned forward. "Is it dangerous?" "Potentially," he said, "but the danger is not in the liquid itself. It lies in what might be done with it, or why a man such as Harov believed it necessary to hide it." He straightened, stepping back with a half-frown. "This is not a mere experiment. It is a message left in the language of a chemist's devotion, a language few can read." Holmes paced twice, his eyes distant as though searching the room for invisible correspondence. Then he stopped abruptly as the bell on our street door rang with a clarity that pierced the quiet like a thrown dagger. "Expecting visitors?" I asked. "No," Holmes replied, and his tone was so low that it seemed a warning to the air rather than an answer. Mrs. Hudson's voice drifted faintly up the stairs. "Mr. Holmes, there is a gentleman insisting upon seeing you." "Insisting," Holmes repeated quietly. "That seldom heralds an innocent inquiry." A moment later, the door opened, and into our sitting room stepped a man whose presence seemed to bend the air around him. He wore an immaculate dark coat that fell elegantly to his boots, and a pair of gloves which he lifted one finger at a time, as though unveiling his hands to the room were a ceremonial act. His face was thin, pale, almost aesthetic, yet his eyes, sharp as a blade's edge, gave the impression of a mind that observed everything and revealed nothing of itself. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said, bowing faintly. "I apologize for the abrupt intrusion. I am Nicholas Ferrier. The name was unfamiliar to me, but Holmes's eyebrow twitched with recognition. Ferrier, he repeated. A name that once drifted about the intellectual salons of the Strand. Though rarely attached to a face, Ferrier smiled with a politeness that did not reach his eyes. I prefer my work to speak for me. And what work is that? Holmes asked. Ferrier stepped further into the room, examining our scattered evidence without appearing to move his eyes from Holmes. My field, he said softly, is the study of applied illumination. Holmes's gaze sharpened like a lens brought suddenly into focus. Harrow's field. Yes, Ferrier replied. We shared interests. He did not elaborate on the nature of those interests, and the careful neutrality of his tone suggested depths better left unspoken. He held himself with a restraint that reminded me uncomfortably of a tightened violin string silent, but capable of producing startling resonance at the slightest provocation. Holmes gestured toward a chair. You may sit, Mr. Ferrier. Ferrier declined the invitation with a courteous shake of his head. I prefer to stand. Holmes folded his arms. You said you shared interests with Harrow. How recently did you see him? Ferrier took a moment to consider his reply, though I suspected the pause was a calculated performance. 2 nights ago, he said. He was disturbed. In what manner? Holmes pressed. In every manner that matters, Ferrier murmured. He believed that something he had created a compound of notable brilliance was no longer safe in his possession. He spoke of watchers, of unseen hands and eyes, of men who would prefer his silence to his success. Holmes's expression did not change, but I felt a shift in the air recognition passing between the two men like a current. And you? Holmes asked quietly. Do you consider his fears rational? Ferrier tilted his head slightly, a gesture that gave the uncanny impression of one dissecting a question as though it were an organism. Fear is seldom rational, he said. But danger? Danger is often quite logical. Holmes's cane tapped once against the floor. You have not yet explained why you have come. Ferrier allowed his gaze to flick to the glowing vial on the table, the only time he granted the object open attention. That, he said, is why I've come. Holmes stepped between him and the table in a movement so subtle it was almost imperceptible. It is not yours, Holmes said. Ferrier's lips curved into a faint approximation of a smile. No, Mr. Holmes, it is not mine. But it is not yours either. It belongs to its creator, and its creator entrusted it to no one. Yet you knew where to find it. I know many things, Ferrier said quietly. It is my work to know them. Something in his voice chilled me, not by volume or tone, but by the calm certainty it carried. He seemed to regard the entire world as a series of lanterns that he could adjust at will. Dim, brighten, extinguish. Holmes regarded him steadily. If you shared such profound interest with Harrow, why did he not turn to you for aid? For the first time, Ferrier's expression shifted. It was not guilt. Holmes would have noted guilt instantly. It was something far more complex. Irritation, perhaps, or the faint sting of wounded pride. He did not trust me, Ferrier said. Holmes nodded once. And I suspect you have not come to make amends. Ferrier exhaled through his nose. I have come, he said, because the city is murmuring. Men in Southwark have begun whispering of lights that move behind darkened windows, and of a chemist seen near the river at hours unfriendly to reason. I assumed you were the only man clever enough to connect these murmurs to something larger. Holmes studied him in silence for several breaths. Then you know where Harrow is. Ferrier did not deny it. You know, Holmes continued quietly, and you have not gone to him. Because, Ferrier said, I am not the one he sent for. Holmes stepped closer. What does he want of me? Farrier's eyes shifted not away from Holmes, but deeper into him. He wants you to understand what he has done, he said. And he wants you to decide whether it should ever be done again. A slow dread coiled in my chest. Holmes's jaw tightened, and I saw him wrestle with a question he dared not ask aloud. Farrier reached for his gloves. Find him soon, he said. For others seek him as well, and unlike me, they will not be patient. He turned toward the door, but paused at its threshold. Oh, and Mr. Holmes, he added without looking back, be cautious when examining his final formula. Light, he murmured, can reveal more than one wishes, and hide even more than one fears. Then he was gone, the door closing sharply behind him, as though he had taken a part of the room's air with him. Holmes stood motionless, absorbing what had passed. When he finally spoke, his voice was weighted with something rare, uncertainty. Watson, he said, Harrov is not the only man in London who knows too much. His gaze drifted toward the glowing vial. And I fear, he added, that dangerous knowledge is beginning to converge. The night after Farrier's visit seemed longer than most, though the hours themselves moved no differently across the face of the mantel clock. Holmes paced until well after midnight, pausing only to cast an occasional glance at the vial on the table. Its faint luminescence surprising even in stillness. I asked if he wished to rest, though I already knew his answer. For Holmes, rest was an indulgence granted only when the mind had exhausted every relevant avenue, and his mind on that night was nowhere near exhaustion. It brimmed instead with tension coiled, analytic, and edged with a worry he endeavored to keep from his features. By morning, the streets outside Baker Street had resumed their ceaseless murmur, though I felt as though some quiet, watchful presence hovered beyond the window panes, listening, measuring our movements. Holmes drank his tea, but did not finish it. When he rose, he did so with the crisp resolve of a man who had elected his course. Watson, he said, London is speaking. We must listen where the voices gather. I fetched my coat, though a question pressed upon my lips. Where shall we begin? Where whispers are nurtured, he replied. Where theory grows in darkness, and scandal is passed hand to hand like contraband. He meant, of course, the corridors of the Strand. The Strand has always possessed a particular temperament, neither as dignified as Mayfair, nor as unruly as the boroughs, but something between, a breeding ground for half-truths, intellectual gossip, and those curious rumors that grow in shape as they pass from lips to lips. The morning fog had lifted by the time we arrived, leaving the gas lamps unlit, yet lingering like mute sentinels over the pavement. Newspapers were already selling briskly. Boys darted among the crowd, thrusting the day's headlines in every direction. I purchased a copy out of habit, though my mind strayed at once to Holmes, who stopped short before the doors of a small tea-room. Observe the patrons, he murmured. 3 men in the far corner, scientific fellows. Judging by their cuffs and spectacles, they stare at us too long to be uninterested, and too discreetly to be innocent. We entered. The warmth of the interior washed over us, carrying the scent of strong tea and toasted bread. Conversations were hushed, as they often were in such places. The Strand's intellectuals did not fear scandal, but they preferred to exchange it quietly. Holmes led us to a table near the window, but his eyes wandered ceaselessly, taking in every small gesture, every flicker of expression. A bespectacled man, whose intellect was betrayed by a certain absent-mindedness in his manner of stirring sugar, leaned toward his companions and muttered, Harrov's theories. Dangerous. Ought never have been. Holmes shifted his chair just enough to catch the thread of the conversation. Not theories, said another man with a scholar's stoop. Experiments, rumor has it, he succeeded. Something about a flame that does not appear as flame. Impossible, the first man whispered. And yet those who know him best say the glow from his window was unlike any lantern's light. Holmes reached for the sugar tongs. Though he had no intention of using it, it was simply another opportunity for his posture to adjust, enabling him to hear more. A third man older, with a nose that seemed permanently inclined toward scholarly disdain, shook his head. There are also the crates unmarked, delivered at night by men who take care not to speak. A laboratory club, a second man offered. A conspiracy, the older corrected, lowering his voice. And Harov is at the center. Holmes sat upright. Watson, he said quietly. Harov's work has escaped the confines of his room. His theories, not yet proven or published, have become a currency. Before I could reply, the door of the tea room opened, and a small wave of cooler air entered. A figure stepped inside, wearing a plain cloak and holding a rolled umbrella. I recognized him instantly. Inspector Lestrade. His sharp glance swept the room before alighting on us. Holmes, he said with a respectful nod. Doctor. Holmes gestured for him to join us. And Lestrade took a seat with a tension that suggested he came bearing something weightier than a social call. You've heard, I suppose, Lestrade said, lowering his voice, of the disappearance in Southwark. Holmes exchanged a measured look with me. Harov. Lestrade's eyebrow rose. You know, good. Then I need not waste time. There's talk, Holmes, talk of chemicals gone missing from warehouses, of peculiar lights observed from the river, and worse talk of 2 bodies found near the embankment with burns unlike any I've seen. My breath caught. Burns? Lestrade nodded. Not like fire, more like light itself bit into their skin. Holmes's expression did not shift, but the cane he held pressed harder into the floor. Show me the report, he said. Lestrade produced a folded envelope from his coat and passed it across. Holmes read it swiftly, his eyes darting left to right in concise movements. When he finished, he closed the papers and leaned back. The burns are not from heat, he said. The fluid reacts to certain wavelengths. Exposure in concentrated form would result in precisely the damage described. Lestrade exhaled. Good God! Then this experiment of your chemists is no mere tinkering. No, Holmes replied. It is something sought after, something men would commit murder to obtain. He leaned forward. Lestrade, do your reports mention any visitors to Harov? The inspector shook his head. The neighbors speak of shadows, of men who come at odd hours, of tapping sounds, but nothing clearer. Holmes nodded once. Then we must look where the rumor is thickest. We stepped back onto the Strand. Leaving the tea-room's murmurs behind, Holmes stood still for a moment, letting the wind catch the edges of his coat. Then he turned toward the street leading east. To the reading rooms, he said. The scholars may speak in whispers, but the newspapers, Watson, newspapers reveal a city's unconscious. We entered one of the Strand's quieter reading halls, where the patrons sat behind tall desks, immersed in broad sheets and journals. Holmes gathered several papers, scanning their columns for the faintest contradiction or obscure mention. I watched his focus sharpen as he compared 2 clippings. Here, he said, pointing. A fire near a warehouse by the Thames reported to be caused by a lantern. Yet witnesses claimed no flame was seen. And here, he added, pulling another sheet, a delivery to a scientific club. Anonymous benefactor, unspecified materials, excessive payment. And lastly, he selected a third article, a peculiar glow spotted beneath a bridge last night. Individually, each story was a curiosity. Together, They formed a narrative as potent and uneasy as the compound itself. Holmes folded the papers. There is a network here, Watson. Men of science and men of commerce, a chain that runs from laboratory benches to river barges, and Harrow stands in the middle of it. No, Holmes said quietly. He stands at the edge. Someone else is at the center. A silence hung between us as the gravity of his words set in. Holmes turned sharply toward the door. "We are leaving," he said. "There is one more place where rumor becomes testimony." "Where?" He stepped outside, his profile severe and purposeful. "To the rooms where minds gather for brilliance or folly," he answered. "To the forgotten corners of the scientific clubs along the Thames. If a conspiracy whispers anywhere, Watson, it whispers there." And as we followed the flow of pedestrians toward the river, I felt London's breath on the back of my neck cool. Watchful and faintly anticipating, Holmes walked quickly, his cane tapping lightly at his side. The city was tightening its circle, and somewhere, whether in shadowed clubrooms or in the recesses of a chemist's ruined laboratory, Simeon Harrow was waiting or hiding or running out of time. Holmes has often remarked that London possesses two anatomies, one built of stone, the other of whispers. If the stonework upholds the city by daylight, it is the whispers that govern it by dusk, and on the evening following our investigation into the Strand's rumors, I felt acutely that we were being borne forward not by the solidity of facts, but by the fluid, murmuring currents of conjecture and unease. The sky had settled into a muted lavender gray that ambiguous hour before the lamplighters finished their rounds, when the last of the daylight falters against the glow of the gas lamps. Holmes walked ahead of me with a renewed determination, his shoulders taut beneath his coat, as though the very air were laden with signals only he could interpret. The Thames was not far, but we did not go there at once. Instead, Holmes turned into a narrow side street that branched off the Strand lane, lined with quiet shop fronts and modest clubs, whose windows flickered with amber light, the sort of establishments where debates thrived unobserved and reputations were either made or quietly undone. As we approached one such club, Holmes's steps slowed. He pressed two fingers lightly to the doorframe, as if gathering impressions from the wood itself. "This," he murmured, "is where men discuss dangerous ideas under the guise of respectable curiosity." The door opened at his touch. A warm wave of tobacco smoke rolled out to greet us, carrying with it the low hum of conversation, not the boisterous noise of the taverns in Southwark, but the careful, deliberate cadence of intellectual men, speaking just loudly enough to be overheard by those whose opinions they respected. Holmes and I moved among them, though it was Holmes who drew glances, some curious, some wary, some unmistakably calculating. Newspapers lay scattered across the tables, alongside journals filled with illustrations of laboratory apparatus, scientific treatises, and the occasional speculative essay. It was a room of minds restless and hungry. Holmes stopped near a group of three gentlemen whose discourse bore the intensity of men dancing near the edges of revelation. One of them, a tall man with a narrow face and high-domed forehead, was gesturing emphatically with his pencil. "I tell you," he insisted, "if Harrow managed what the rumors claim, it overturns a century of assumptions. Light without flame, luminescence born of chemical equilibrium rather than ignition. It would be an achievement to rival Davy himself." His companion shook his head. "Or an abomination," he muttered. "The Board of Scientific Ethics would censure him. Imagine a substance capable of shedding its radiance in hidden wavelengths, light that illuminates only under particular conditions. What sort of man would wish for light not visible to the ordinary eye?" Holmes leaned slightly toward them, his voice as smooth and unobtrusive as the glide of a violin bow across its strings. What indeed? The three men turned at once, startled. Holmes, the tall one breathed. I did not see you there. Holmes gave a faint, polite smile. Few do when they wish not to. I overheard mention of our elusive chemist. Simeon Harov, the narrow-faced man, nodded. His name is everywhere today, though never in print. Men speak of him in libraries, in the reading rooms, even in Parliament's antechambers. A strange glow seen in his window. Packages delivered at unusual hours. Dock workers burned by some invisible fire. None of it appears in the papers. Yet all of it passes from mouth to mouth. Why suppressed? Holmes asked. The third gentleman, a stout fellow with a kindly but anxious face, lowered his voice. Because certain parties benefit from ignorance, and others from secrecy. Holmes's eyes flashed with interest. Which parties? The man hesitated, glancing about the room. Then he leaned in. There is a consortium, he whispered. Informal, powerful. Nameless, collection of wealthy patrons and brilliant minds who sponsor research that skirts the boundaries of propriety. The tall man added, they take an interest in anything with military or industrial value. Rumor claims they approached Harov 2 months ago. He declined their involvement. Holmes's jaw tightened a fraction. And they did not take kindly to refusal? So it is said, the anxious man murmured, though nothing can be verified. Conspiracy thrives best when clothed in silence. Holmes nodded once. Thank you, gentlemen. We withdrew, leaving the trio in a pale hush. I followed Holmes across the room to a table near the fireplace, where a pile of letters and discarded notes lay abandoned. He sorted through them with swift, precise motions, pausing only when he came upon a half-crumpled envelope whose seal had been broken in haste. Inside lay a small advertisement clipped from a chemist's circular. London supplier seeks experienced laboratory assistant. Familiarity with rare earth phosphors preferred. Holmes tapped the page. A message in plain sight. Harov's knowledge is being sought publicly disguised. Privately directed. Before I could remark upon it, a young man approached, nervous, thin, with the complexion of one who lived more among furnaces than daylight. Mr. Holmes, he whispered, I did not expect to see you here, but perhaps it is providential. Holmes regarded him with measured interest. Your name? Samuel Critchley, sir. I serve as porter at the Scientific Club on Dorset Street. There have been developments. Holmes rose at once. Show me. Critchley led us outside, looking over his shoulder frequently, as though afraid of being followed. The sky had grown darker. The first gas lamps flickered to life along the Strand, their halos casting the street in soft amber. We hurried through the narrowing lanes until a tall, sober-faced building came into view, its columns flanking a door of heavy oak. This way, Critchley said, ushering us inside. The corridor smelled faintly of beeswax and ink. Lamps along the walls had been dimmed, lending the place an air of discreet secrecy. Critchley guided us downstairs to a cramped storage room where crates were stacked in uneven rows. He pointed toward a particular crate whose lid lay open. Delivered this morning, he said. No one signed for it, but it was addressed to the club. Holmes approached it cautiously. Inside lay bundles of papers, each wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped one and revealed a series of sketches, laboratory diagrams, unfamiliar apparatus, and chemical notations. The signature in the corner was unmistakably Harov's. I felt a coldness grip my spine. Stolen, I said. Or given under duress, Holmes corrected softly. These are drafts, unfinished ideas. Work he likely never meant to share. He examined another bundle. This one contained correspondence letters written in haste. The ink smeared, Holmes read a line aloud. They are drawing closer. The window is no longer safe. I must send what I can before they come again. The words struck me with sudden dread. Holmes's hand hovered over the final line. You must understand before they do. Come quickly. Critchley swallowed hard. There is more. Sir? He moved a small crate aside to reveal a scrap of fabric, pinned beneath it a torn piece of coat sleeve. Singed at the edges, Holmes knelt, brushing his thumb over the charred threads. This, he said gravely, was burned by Harrow's compound. Then he was here, I asked. Or pursued here, Holmes murmured. Either way. The circle tightens. He rose at once, his face sharp with purpose. Watson, we must return to the river. Conspiracy begins in whispers. But it concludes where secrecy can be buried. And Harrow? I asked. Holmes's expression darkened. He is running, but running out of places to hide. Critchley flinched at the sudden creak of the floorboards above. Footsteps hurried heavy. Holmes motioned sharply. Out the side door. We followed, slipping into the alley behind the club. The cold struck my face like a warning. Holmes turned his gaze toward the river. The truth gathers there, Watson, he said. London is whispering louder. And soon, very soon, its voices will demand answers. The wind carried the scent of the Thames, damp, metallic, and faintly luminous, as though the river itself had begun to glow with the weight of all it had witnessed. Holmes pulled up his collar. To the water, he said. We have only begun to glimpse the design. And with that, we quickened our pace toward the dim silhouette of the river, where shadows moved like conspirators between the lamplight and the tide. Night had deepened by the time we reached the embankment once more. Though the river did not sleep, it rarely does. The Thames at midnight is a restless creature throat murmuring against the stone. Dark surface shifting like a thought that refuses to settle. A chill wind swept along the water, carrying a faint metallic scent that pricked my memory of Harrow's laboratory. Holmes noticed it at once. He paused mid-stride, tilted his head, and inhaled with the precision of a man distinguishing chords in a symphony. It is here, he murmured. Whatever Harrow pursued has found its way into the river's breath. His compound? I asked. Or the consequences of it, he replied, eyes narrowing as though the water itself were attempting to communicate in a language only he could decipher. The gas lamps along the embankment flickered as we approached the stairs leading down to the river steps. Holmes moved cautiously, far more cautiously than he had earlier that day, his cane tapping lightly as he descended each wet stone. The night pressed softly at our backs, urging silence upon us. It was the kind of darkness that seemed to listen. At the final step, Holmes stopped abruptly and knelt. A thin trail of residue scarcely visible, except when the moonlight caught it gleamed upon the stone like a ghost of spilled mercury. Harrow was here, he said. How can you be certain? He answered not with words, but by drawing a small reagent bottle from his pocket. He dabbed a drop onto the residue, and the faint shimmer pulsed with a dull, unnatural glow. No other compound behaves in this manner, Holmes said quietly. He handled the vial, perhaps, several vials here not long ago. My heart quickened. Was he seeking to destroy them or conceal them? Concealment, Holmes murmured, would be futile here. The river devours secrets too thoroughly for any man to reclaim them. No, he was moving something. And he was not alone. He pointed toward the muddy stretch near the water. There, half washed by tide, lay two distinct sets of footprints, one deep and uneven, the other light and hurried. The heavier prints staggered slightly, as though the person had been injured or exhausted. The lighter prints circled, doubled back, and vanished near the edge. Holmes followed them with keen interest. The lighter prints belonged to an attendant or accomplice, likely the same youth mentioned by the dock worker. But the heavier... He crouched and pressed 2 fingers into the deepest impression. Harov himself, he said, but weakened. His steps betray fatigue or fear. The river exhaled long and slow, and a faint ripple of light darted across its surface. Not moonlight, not lantern glow, something else. A radiance that seemed to bubble up from beneath the water before sinking again into obscurity. I shuddered involuntarily. Holmes observed it with grave satisfaction. "There," he said softly. "Proof that something meant to be contained has been released." Before I could speak, a voice drifted from behind us, a voice neither loud nor furtive, but oddly composed. "You are too late, mister?" Holmes. We turned at once. A figure stepped from the shadow beneath the archway. A thin, austere silhouette I recognized even before the lantern light revealed him fully. Nicholas Ferrier. Holmes's expression hardened into that rare, cold focus I had witnessed only when he confronted a man whose intellect matched his own. "Ferrier," he said, "you knew Harov had been here." Ferrier approached with measured steps, his coat trailing like a shadow unbound from its owner. His eyes so still they seemed carved shone faintly in the lamplight. "I knew," he said, "because I followed him here last night." "You followed him?" I demanded. "Why not intervene?" Ferrier's face tightened, though with what emotion I could not say. "Because intervention would have meant coercion. And Harov trusted me only in the manner a man trusts a mirror enough to reflect. Never enough to reveal." Holmes regarded him sharply. "You allowed him to come here alone." "I did not allow him," Ferrier replied. "I arrived too late." He gestured toward the river. "I saw him standing at the water's edge, staring into the tide as though it were the only confidant left to him." Holmes stepped closer. "What did he do?" Ferrier's posture grew strangely heavy, as if the memory itself weighed upon him. "He dropped a case into the river," Ferrier said. "A metal one, weighted, sealed. He held it to his chest as if debating whether to cling to it or abandon it. And then," his voice thinned, "he let it fall." Holmes's teeth clicked softly as he considered the implications. "And the youth?" he asked. "The attendant?" Ferrier shook his head. "I saw no attendant, only Harov." Holmes's brow furrowed, and he turned back toward the footprints. "Then someone else sought him later." The wind carried a faint echo of laughter from an unseen alley and eerie, hollow sound that vanished as swiftly as it came. Ferrier's attention snapped toward it. "You are not the only one searching for him," he said. "There are others, men who believe Harov has given London something of value." "Value is a relative term," Holmes replied quietly. "Danger is rather more consistent," Ferrier exhaled. "You speak as though you already know what he created." Holmes regarded the river before answering. "I know what he attempted. A compound that glows without flame. A substance reactive to specific wavelengths. A liquid light that can burn without heat." "Burn without heat?" Ferrier repeated. "Yes, a most unsettling concept. Yet an elegant one." Holmes's voice darkened. "Unsettling enough. 2 men are dead." Ferrier stiffened. "I heard, but I assumed." "You assumed?" Holmes cut sharply. "Do not assume, Mr. Ferrier. We stand upon the edge of a precipice, and assumption is the only force eager to push us over." Ferrier's composure faltered at last. "Holmes," he said quietly, urgent, "the consortium seeks him. They believe he perfected a form of illumination with strategic applications they would not hesitate to exploit." Holmes replied coldly. "Strategic applications seldom concern the safety of those they illuminate." The river shimmered again briefly. Almost shyly and then dimmed, Holmes watched it with an intensity bordering on reverence. Harriv, he murmured, was not trying to perfect light. He was trying to perfect invisibility. The silence that followed was absolute. Ferrier's face drained of what little color it possessed. Invisibility, not of the man, Holmes clarified, but of the illumination. A light that reveals only to those who possess the correct reagent or wavelength. A light that can expose what is hidden or conceal what is not. I felt a coldness spread along my spine. Holmes. Such a thing could be used for espionage, Holmes finished, for detection, for assassination, for any act where concealment is more valuable than the act itself. Ferrier stepped closer, his voice trembling at the edges. If that is true, then Harriv created something no man should attempt. He did, Holmes said. He turned abruptly toward the steps. Watson, he said, we must find him before the consortium does. Where do we look? I asked. Holmes scanned the riverbank, his eyes narrowing. Not where he worked, he murmured. Where he hid. Ferrier frowned. Which is? Holmes's gaze fixed upon the dark labyrinth of alleys leading away from the river, where London's quiet secrets waited in shadows. Southwark, he said softly, but deeper to a place he once showed me long ago, when he still believed knowledge was a companion rather than a weapon. He started up the steps, determination sharpening each stride. Holmes, Ferrier called after him. If we find him, do you intend to save him? Holmes's answer came without turning. I intend, he said, to save London. The wind rose behind us, and somewhere beneath the tide, a faint glow flickered like the last gasp of a dying star. Holmes moved with such purpose through the winding streets of Southwark that I was forced to keep close. Lest I lose him among the maze of alleys, the lamps flickered overhead, their light pooling in uneven circles that seemed to retreat from our passing. The deeper we ventured, the more London shed its familiar facade. Here the city felt raw, narrow arteries of stone pulsing with an older life, a life that belonged not to shopkeepers or clerks, but to those who had made secrecy their trade. Holmes walked as if retracing a memory rather than following a clue, his step sure even in the darkest corners. Ferrier trailed behind us, his breathing steady, though there was a tension about him, a hunter's anticipation mixed with a scholar's dread. At last, Holmes halted before a dilapidated structure tucked between two warehouses that loomed like indifferent guardians. The building was narrow, three-storied, with a broken signboard that might once have displayed a tradesman's name. Now it bore only a ghostly imprint, like writing erased by time. Holmes touched the rusted doorknob, but did not turn it. He brought me here once, he said quietly, long before his exile from respectable circles. It was a private refuse, and an X he used when he required solitude beyond the eyes of colleagues. Then he may still be inside, I whispered. Or what remains of him? Ferrier murmured grimly. Holmes cast him a cutting glance. Reserve your conclusions, Mr. Ferrier. We are not yet at the end. He pressed the door. It yielded with a long, plaintive sigh like a weary soul resigning itself to intrusion. We stepped into darkness. The air was thick with dust and chemical residue, so dense it felt almost tactile. Holmes struck a match. Its small flame flickered, casting a hesitant glow upon shelves lined with jars, some empty, others containing powders whose hues spoke of dangerous origins. We ascended the narrow stairs. Each step groaned beneath our weight. Each echo seemed to fall into a space wider than the building itself. On the landing, Holmes paused, tilting his head toward a door slightly ajar. A faint light leaked from the gap, wavering, uncertain, Like a candle flame struggling against its own demise, Holmes pushed the door open. The upper room was almost monastic in simplicity. A single desk, scattered papers, a bed whose sheets were twisted by recent use. And there, slumped over the desk, his fingers curled around a vial whose glow had dulled to a dying glimmer, lay Simeon Harov. I rushed forward, but Holmes's arm barred my path. "Watson," he murmured, "observe first." His voice was soft, but carried the weight of instruction. I stepped back and let Holmes kneel beside the unmoving figure. His hand hovered above Harov's wrist, then settled gently. For a moment, he remained perfectly still, listening. Feeling at last, he exhaled and looked up at me. "He is alive," Holmes said. "Barely." Relief flooded me, though it was shadowed by the pallor of the chemist's face. His cheeks were sunken, his lips cracked, his breathing shallow. The faint shimmer of the vial bathed his hand in a ghostly hue. On the table beside him lay an arrangement of symbols and diagrams that made my head swim, even as I attempted to make sense of them. Ferrier approached slowly, his footsteps measured. "We must remove the vial," he said. "The exposure." Holmes rose abruptly, blocking him. "Do not touch it." Ferrier's brow furrowed. "Holmes," I said, "do not touch it." The intensity in Holmes's voice froze Ferrier as surely as ice. I had heard Holmes speak sternly, sharply, with moral fury, but never with this particular timbre. This was the voice of a man who had glimpsed a precipice and refused to let another take a single step closer. Holmes leaned over the desk once more. "Harov," he whispered. "Harov, can you hear me?" The chemist stirred faintly, his eyelids fluttering like thin, exhausted wings. A fragile sound escaped him, a breath shaped into something almost like a word. "Holmes." The single syllable drifted from Harov's lips like a dying ember. Holmes's face softened, a rare, fleeting glimpse of the man beneath his armor. "Yes, my friend." "I'm here," Harov swallowed with difficulty. I tried to stop them," he murmured, "but they wanted the formula. They said it would change everything." "Who?" Holmes asked gently. Harov's gaze shifted toward Ferrier, not with fear, but with recognition. Ferrier's expression fractured something between remorse and despair. Holmes did not follow the glance immediately. His attention remained fixed upon Harov. "Why come here?" "To finish it," Harov whispered. "To dismantle it piece by piece. But the last reaction. Unstable. I needed time." Holmes looked at the glowing vial in Harov's hand. "And this?" "A mistake," Harov breathed. "The final flame, it sees without being seen. It reveals too much, hides too much." His voice cracked into silence. Holmes lifted the vial with extraordinary care, holding it as one might hold a volatile truth. "It must be destroyed," he said softly. Ferrier shook his head. "Destroyed?" "Holmes, this could illuminate every laboratory in Europe. It could advance science by decades." Holmes turned slowly. "Or it could arm men with a weapon no one can see until after the harm is done." Ferrier fell silent. Holmes approached the window, its cracked pane mirroring the broken glass in Harov's shop. He held the vial up to the night air. The shimmer within it intensified subtly, responding to the moonlight as though recognizing a kinship. "Holmes," I warned, "if it reacts—" "Yes," he murmured. "It reacts to light, but not all light. Only a certain wavelength." He opened the window. A gust stirred the room, lifting the edges of Harov's scattered notes. The vial glimmered for a last, trembling instant, then Holmes tipped it. It fell not swiftly, but with a strange, resisting grace, as though unwilling to surrender its purpose. When it struck the cobblestones below, The liquid burst into a silent bloom of radiance brilliant for a heartbeat, then extinguished, swallowed by the night as though it had never been. Farrier inhaled sharply. "Holmes, do you realize what you've done?" Holmes closed the window with a decisive click. "Yes," he said simply. "I have prevented a world from seeing what it might not have survived for a long moment." None of us spoke. The room felt lighter, though tinged with the melancholy of things forever lost. Holmes returned to Harrow's side. "We must bring him to help," he said. But Harrow's hand reached out weakly and caught Holmes's wrist. "Burn them," he whispered. "The papers." "All of them?" Holmes hesitated only a second before nodding. "Yes," he said. "I understand." Farrier looked stricken. But he did not argue. Holmes gathered the notes, those pages of brilliance in peril, and placed them into the hearth. I lit them with the lantern's flame. They curled, blackened, vanished. No light escaped their destruction, only a soft sigh. As though the room itself felt relief, Holmes lifted Harrow gently. "We must get him to safety," as we descended the stairs. A cracked window above watched us with its pale, fractured eye, no longer a sentinel of secrecy, but the final witness to a man's ruin and redemption. Outside, the night air felt clearer. As though London had exhaled, Holmes paused at the foot of the steps, shifting Harrow's weight in his arms. "Watson," he said quietly, "knowledge is a flame, and some flames are meant to die." Behind him, Farrier stood motionless, the truth of that statement settling upon him like cold ash. And for the first time since the beginning of the case, I sensed that the shadows which had clung to London were loosening, dispersing like smoke after a fire long smoldered. Whatever history would make of Harrow's work, the city would never know. Holmes had seen to that. And as he carried the fragile chemist into the waiting dawn, I understood that some victories are not triumphs. They are simply salvations wrestled from the brink.